Psalm 46, 1 through 5. The scriptures say this morning. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. Selah. Selah, they don't quite know what that word means in the Hebrew. Translators for the last 2,000 years have transcribed it in different translations of the Bible in different ways, but the most common way that word described, it's a Hebrew word, Selah, is to pause and reflect. It's believed that this was a music term. There would be an interlude in the music to cause people to stop for a moment. Pause, reflect. Verse 4 says, there is a river whose streams shall make glad. Everybody say joy. Shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, in the midst of his people. She shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. Now, obviously, that's a little different for a Christmas scripture, right? Kind of a weird scripture to start with this morning, but my goal is to show you that even in the days of King David, that God had a pattern that he often followed in his people's lives. And it's that pattern that I want to kind of show you this morning to give you the hope that we really should be celebrating in this season. Here's a psalm or a song that is written by King David talking about a time of trouble. A time, he says, when the earth shall be removed, when mountains are being brought into the sea, a time when the waters roar and are troubled, a time when the mountains that aren't falling into the sea are literally shaking. I don't know about you, but when you read through this, you have to think about this is a time that sounds pretty dark. This is a time that sounds pretty gloomy. It's almost scary. And yet, the writer, inspired by God, would say that in the midst of the world crashing down around you, to take a Selah, pause, and reflect. In the midst of chaos, pause and reflect. In the midst of dark and gloomy, pause and reflect. In the midst of fear starting to rise up inside of you because of what your eyes see, the writer says to pause and reflect. And if you notice what he does, he takes a pause to reflect on where God happens to be in his life. In the past, in the present, and in the future. Because he says these words, God is our refuge and strength. He's reminding himself in that moment when the world's crashing around him. God is our refuge. He's our safe place. God is our strength. He's the one who gives me strength. He is a very present help. That means that he is present, though it may not look like he is present because the world's crashing down around me and the mountains are being carried into the sea and the waters are raging. God is still present. And he's not just present, but believe it or not, he's a help even when you don't see him. He's working. Even when it looks dark and gloomy, he's working. Even when your world is chaos, he is working. It says that God is in the midst of her. He's in our midst, that we shouldn't be moved, that God shall help her. But when does it say that God shall help her? It says just. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. This morning, I want to talk to somebody about taking a Selah, because it's always darkest before the dawn. Somebody needs to hear this word this morning. It's time for a Selah, a pause and reflect. Whatever's going on in your life, because it's always darkest before the dawn. But the light is coming. This morning we move into what would be called Stave 4, Chapter 4 of our Christmas series, A Christmas Carol. And we have looked at the Scrooge, and we've seen Ebenezer Scrooge be visited by our fourth ghost today. First, he was visited by his friend Jacob Marley, who had talked to him about the chains that he had forged in life and he was carrying around in life because of the way that he lived his life. He was visited by the ghost of Christmas past, and the ghost of Christmas past showed him not just all the bad things in life, but the good things that had happened in his life too. The importance of being able to embrace both the good and the bad in your past in order to heal enough to be able to move forward. Last week we looked at how he was visited by the ghost of Christmas present, and today we're going to see how he has been visited or will be visited by the ghost of what some call Christmas future. Throughout this time we have seen Scrooge's heart, which was very, very hard, cold as flint. He was a ruthless man, gradually be moved to a place of having emotion. We've seen that the eyes of his heart were opened up over time. But what we quite haven't seen yet, though his heart's changing, there's a transformation that's begun to take place. It's warmed and his eyes have been opened, is we haven't seen any action from him yet. And you don't really know if change is taking place until you see the fruit of change. And you will always see the change in people's lives when there is true change. Charles Dickens describes the ghost of Christmas as a phantom. And he writes these words: "The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded." Scrooge has had the benefit of having this pause in his life to reflect on where he is. And right now he is facing his darkest moment. As the ghost of Christmas future, or the ghost of Christmas yet to come, brings him into what his life may be in the future. And so quickly, if you don't know the story or haven't seen the movie, as he goes into the future, and I just want to point out a few key things from the book. The first place that he's brought is to a group of businessmen that he knows. They're discussing somebody who had died. But in their discussion of this person that died, they really showed no remorse. They were actually mocking his death. They were saying how lonely it will be. Nobody will probably even show up. One guy says, "You know what, if they serve lunch, I'll show up." We find that in the church all the time. Have a potluck, everybody comes for food. All right. Have a funeral, I'll show up if you're feeding people. That's what they're talking about. No remorse. So then he gets taken to another group of businessmen. Those two businessmen are talking about some guy that died. Just a brief moment of conversation, then they move on about ice skating. They could care less about the person that died. So then he gets taken to another place in the city that's kind of like the hoodlum. And he gets taken to this shop where this guy takes things from people, anything that they will bring to him, and he purchased them from them for a very low price because those items more than likely came from a sketchy place in a sketchy way. And the three people that show up when Scrooge arrives upon the scene with the ghost of Christmas yet to come are three people who had worked in this home of this dead man, this same dead man, whoever this dead man is. And the one guy is bringing things from the home that he just kind of stole from the house. The other ladies brought some of his clothes, because a dead man don't need clothes. And then the other woman brought the curtains that go around the bed and the sheets that the body laid on. And then as they discussed how they all showed up at the same time after having ripped off this guy that died, they were laughing about it. Well, he deserved it. Look at the way he lived his life. And he heard all these things being said, and Scrooge was like, who is this man that all these people show no emotion for? And so he's taken to this dead body, and it's covered with a sheet, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come tells him to remove the sheet so he can see who it is, and he can't. He doesn't want to face death. He doesn't want to face who it is. And he says, show me somebody with emotion. And so he gets taken to a couple. And the couple, we're talking about this person that had died, the same person. And they were joyful. They were rejoicing because they owed this guy money. And now they don't have to pay him. And if they do have to pay, it'll be somebody else, and it won't be as strict as he was. And so there's this relief in their life, and they're rejoicing over the fact that this person had died. And Scrooge is like, what is going on? That's not the emotion, obviously, that I was looking for. Show me somebody who has grief in life over death. And so he gets taken to another family's home. These people are grieving tremendously over death. And so he thinks, finally. But then he hears their words, and they begin to describe how they're not grieving over this man's death. They're grieving over their son's death. Tiny Tim, who had passed away. And so he sees, well, this is at least emotion in the right way, but that's still not for the guy. And so he gets taken to a gravestone, and he's wondering, who is this poor soul? And it's here at the gravestone that the ghost of Christmas yet to come points, and Scrooge walks over to see that the name on the gravestone is Ebenezer Scrooge. It is his own. He falls on his knees and he begins to beg for his life. All of a sudden, by facing what may be in the future, he's decided he needs to be a changed person. You know, he may have thought things were bad in his past and maybe even a little bit worse in his present, but now that he's had to face the future, he's had this recognition of the fullness of truth. And so this morning, I just want to give you 3 points real quick about taking the steps to help bring the light into your life. That same light we read about in Psalm 45, the light in the darkness that will arrive, that light that brings change in life. And number 1 is you've got to have the ability to be able to recognize your dark. It isn't until Scrooge hears all the bad things that people have been saying about him, all the bad things that people have done to him, all the lack of concern in his absence, the foul way that he's treated in comparison to the family that showed so much love in mourning over Tiny Tim, that he's able to finally realize how dark and gloomy his life not only is, but will become if he continues down the same path that he has always went in life. Sometimes you have to recognize how dark it actually is. A lot of people, especially people who were raised in church, like from young on up, They have a hard time really knowing who Jesus is as their Savior. They may have their religion's faith, they may have their parents' faith, they may have somebody else's faith, but they ain't got their own faith because they've never really seen the dark in their own lives. I'm a good person. I've went to church. I've taken communion. I've went through confirmation. I've taken the membership classes, whatever it might have been. I was a part of youth group. Or even if they didn't go to church much, they've had a lot of blessings in their life. And so they think, well, I'm just a good person. And so, I'm okay. I'm going to get to heaven because of all the good things that I've done. And I'm nice to people. And I'm not molesting kids and murdering people. And I haven't killed anybody like that. So, you know what, I'm going to make it. And the truth is, they're one of the biggest challenges in life to bring to the light of Christ because they don't see the darkness in their own lives. Now, I know that everybody that's here this morning would say probably that they are saved, that they've received Christ into their life, that they're okay. But the truth is, more than likely, every single one of us still has some places of darkness, if not many places of darkness that are within our heart that we hold on to, that we are afraid to release because of what may be in life if we do. It's important if you want to continue to grow, if you want to continue to become more like Christ, if you want to see more change in your life and live the abundant life that Christ came for on this earth, that you are able to recognize the darkness in your own life. Recognize that darkness. It's important that we see what other people think. When Scrooge was able to recognize it, he was able to take that next step. Really, that's the darkness. You ever been like, something happens to you and you're driving down the road and you have all these thoughts go through your head and then they're not good thoughts? Anybody have those times? I'm not just talking about the person that, cut you off and flipped you off. I'm talking about, something, maybe somebody's hurt you or something's gone on and you begin to create this story in your head about them. And then, this isn't the way I think, but you might think like, I'd like to see that person just completely cut out of my life. I wouldn't even care if I ever see that person. Like, you ever think thoughts like that? Again, I'm not one that thinks like that. I'm just saying, like, we create these stories and then we get all ruthless in our head, and though we know it's not right, we go there for a while in our head. And then you ever just stop and think like, wow, why do I think like that? Have you guys ever had those moments? Like, why is my head going there? Or you ever like wake up from a dream and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to tell anybody about that dream. Like, there is still some darkness inside of me. And you have to have the ability to be able to recognize that darkness to move on to the next step of growth, of change, of moving towards, Christ in your life. That light. That next step is that Selah moment. That darkness should cause you to pause and reflect. When Scrooge sees his grave, he immediately begins to ask these questions about the importance of changing. And I find it interesting, the questions that he'd ask. Basically, he's saying, can a person change their ending by changing their story? Can a person change their future by changing their present? Can they change their destiny by changing their direction? Can there really be a change in the end if I'm changing now as a person? He really wants to know. He's pausing and reflecting on his own life. And when he sees his own gravestone, it causes him to reflect on the actions that have led him to the place that he currently is. And he begins to cry out in those moments, I am not the man I was. In fact, he begins to cry out for hope. You would not have brought me here, would you have, if I had not hope? He wants hope in life. He wants the ability to all of a sudden be able to show that there's a change in his life. Finally, I picture Scrooge looking at his name on that gravestone, and he'd gotten to that place where, he didn't like the way people were talking. He didn't like what they were doing to him. He didn't like the way life was going. And so it took him seeing his own name on a gravestone to bring him to the place of action in life. You know how often we get to those places where we may not like the way that people treat us. We may not like the way that people talk about us. We may not like the things that are going on in our lives. And sometimes it takes us looking in the mirror to see that we are the Scrooge. Pause and reflect. Where is the darkness in my life? And in that moment of realizing he is really the Scrooge, he becomes desperate for change. I'm ready for change, but can I actually walk it out? Can I live this life? Can I show the change? Point number 3 is you can talk about change a lot, but you have to have the ability to show the change. When true change happens, you'll see it because the light is on it. Scrooge cries out again, I'm not the man I was. He cries out for hope. He wants the opportunity to be able to show to all of those people and to the world around him that he truly is a changed man. In the midst of all the darkness, he has experienced the light, and he wants to bring that light now to other people. In his darkest hour, he paused to see the light, because it's always darkest before the dawn, but the light is coming. Today, we're also celebrating a Jewish feast we've never really promoted a lot in the church. We've set up for it. Something called Hanukkah. And I believe that it's this Jewish holiday called Hanukkah, that it's a very fitting time in the year for this celebration, this Jewish holiday. For those who don't know what Hanukkah is, just the short story real quick. I want to show you God's pattern. Is that the story of Hanukkah is a story of a time when God's people were turning away from God. Alexander the Great, historically, had conquered the world, basically. He was in control of Israel. And everything was okay because he allowed people to worship however they wanted to worship. But when he died, his actual generals all split it up, but 2 of them mainly were surrounding Israel and fighting over that nation. One of the generals took control of the nation, and he just wanted them to change and become Greeks. They were all Greek, and they wanted to spread the influence of the Greek culture into all of the nations. And if they were allowed to continue their traditions and following their faith, they would never fully become Greek. And so they started persecuting the Israelites. And they did not allow any following of the faith. So if a mother took her child to be circumcised, for example, something that's a part of the Jewish faith, not only the mother would be killed, but the baby would be killed as well. They were serious about making sure change would take place. It was a dark time in the nation of Israel. And then some of the Jews began to convert, and that's where you get the biblical term, the Hellenistic Jew. And they started to follow the Greek ways. The religious leaders began to grow soft, and they didn't really do anything anymore because they didn't want to be persecuted themselves. And most of the people started going that way. There was this time, I would imagine, where there was this pause and reflection for those who wanted to hold on to their faith. Do we face being killed for following what we believe? Or do we stand for what we believe? There was a pause and a time of reflection. And it was in that time that there was this small band of men that rose up in a family that is called the Maccabees. And they decided to fight back. And they went to war with a few thousand men. And they fought against the Syrian army of 40,000. And they crushed the Syrian army over a period of battles. After they defeated the Syrians, they walked into their holy city, Jerusalem. much more than just a capital. It's God's city. They wanted to see their temple restored because the Syrian king had sacrificed a pig inside of the temple and defiled everything. An abomination. And so they went in there to cleanse it, to make it right, to start worship for their people all over again. When they got in there, one of the first things that they wanted to do is light their menorah, representative of the dark times are now gone, and the light of God has arrived. Now, the story behind this is that there was one vial of oil that was left over, and that vial would only last for a day to burn the menorah. It would take at least 7 days to purify oil in order to be truly used correctly in the temple. And so they put the oil in the menorah, and they started the menorah, and then they started the purification process. And it lasted miraculously for 8 days. The light burned. And so now the Jews celebrate what they call the Feast of Dedication. It's a time, Hanukkah is a time where they celebrate dedicating themselves or rededicating themselves to God. To God's ways, to God's works, to His good works, to the good fruit. But because of the miracle of the light, they also call it the Festival of Lights. And so there's lights that represent, I believe, the light of God who had come to the earth in one of the darkest times in Israel's history. His light shone forth, showing the change in the nation of Israel. And now we have the Christmas story. And I'm not one who traditionally follows the Christmas story. If you want tradition, come on Christmas Eve. I want to bring about to you the purpose. Where was the nation of Israel at the time, spiritually, emotionally, physically, when it came to the birth of God upon the earth? The Word became flesh. Where was the nation? It may not surprise you, but Isaiah in chapter 9, verses 1 through 6 describes what the nation will be like when He comes. He says, "Nevertheless, the gloom," everybody say gloom, "will not be upon her who is distressed. The people who walked in darkness," say darkness. This is just a quick 2-sentence description of the gloom and the darkness of the nation of Israel for those who aren't following after God at the time. Can we turn the lights back on, please? Oh yeah, it got dark. See, that was just all theatric for my sermon. And then I go and blow it. I should have just left it, went with it. Isaiah 9, 1 through 6, "Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed. The people who walked in darkness," they've been walking in darkness, "have now seen a great light." What caused them to see this light? "Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death," everybody say death. So we have gloom, we have darkness, we have death. "Upon them a light has shined." What in the world has shined upon these people? Verse 3, "You, God, have multiplied the nation and increased its joy." I want to say that there's some connection between light and joy. When things are lit, there's a joy that takes place. The light brings joy in people's lives. The light brought joy in Scrooge's life. The light brings joy in your life. He's multiplied and increased it. "They rejoice before you, God, according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden." There was a time of burden, "the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle, and the garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel of fire. For unto us," you see this description of life that was. And then, "For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. And the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Isaiah describes this time when Christ was born as a terrible time of gloom, of darkness, and death. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty dark, doesn't it? And yet it's always darkest before the dawn, but the light is coming. Would there be a pause and reflection for God's people that would lead to a change, that would lead to the light? You know that before Christ was born upon the earth, there's this period called the silent years. It's the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was the time between the writing of the book of Malachi, the prophet, and the beginning of the story of John the Baptist. It is a time that is described of 400 plus years that God did not speak to his people. Now, if you look throughout this time period, he may have spoke to a person individually. You notice at the birth of Christ, God had spoken to Simeon and Anna, that he was speaking to Zechariah and obviously Mary and her cousin. But through a prophet, as a whole to the people, it was a time of silence. 400 years, God didn't speak. And I believe that is described in the same book that we get the story of Hanukkah out of. It's in Maccabees. Maccabees, without going into a historical study on the producing of our Bible, Maccabees is in the Catholic Bible. Maccabees is considered Apocrypha in the Protestant Church, which is a respected writing, but yet not a inspired writing. In Maccabees 9:27, 1 Maccabees, it says, of that time period. This is the time period the Maccabees lived in, that 400 years when God didn't speak. There was such a great distress in Israel. It was the worst since the time when the prophets ceased to appear among them. When you look at Jewish writings, it's described as the greatest time of darkness in history in that 400 years. A time of distress, a time of darkness, a time of death, exactly how Isaiah described it would be in chapter 9. For 400 years, God didn't speak to his people. For 400 years, there was a pause. I believe that God was allowing a time of reflection, the silence, a Selah. Not for him, but for us, for his people. He wants them to recognize it's always darkest before the dawn, but the light is coming. The Apostle Paul tells us in Galatians 4:4 that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. It was after that 400 period of darkness and gloom, that 400 period of pause and reflection, that the fullness of time had come. And God decided, enough is enough. And he sent forth his Son. Unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. There had to be a recognition of how dark things really were. A pause in time, and then a bringing of the light that would reflect a time of change. Isaiah 9:2 again says, they walked in darkness, they dwelt in the shadow of death, but upon them a light has shined. Through God's Son, through the birth of Christ, a change took place in their lives. That change can take place in your life still today. God's light through Christ is not only on Christ, but it's supposed to be on you and I. That change is supposed to be reflected in our lives. John 8:12 says, Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. Jesus was the light. But the next part of that scripture says, he who follows me, he who says, I believe in God, he who says, I believe in Jesus, he who says, I am a follower of Jesus. It states, he who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but they have the light of life. You and I are supposed to have that light of life. You and I are supposed to be reflecting that same change that Jesus brought when he was born upon the earth and showed the life that we could all live, so that the world around us in their greatest time of darkness can see that same light, can have that same hope. You know, it was after the darkness that Scrooge was lit. The Maccabees were lit. Jesus was lit. And God wants us to be lit too. The spreading of his eternal light to the world around us. And with that light, as we've seen in the Psalms and in all of these writings, is supposed to be a joy. Just the opposite of Scrooge, but a joy. And so my challenge to you as we go on to face our families, our aunts and our uncles, we won't talk about crazy aunts and weird uncles, people that you may not like to deal with in your life or rub you wrong, is that you realize the darkness in your own life. Pause and reflect, and that you're still able to show them the change. You're still able to show them the light of Christ in your life by showing the joy that is so exemplified in this season that we call Christmas.